We're not going to master plan our way into certainty.
Do our cities actually work for the people who live in them?
The first thing I would change in most cities would be zoning. I'm a big fan of mixed use, being able to run all my errands, take care of everything, all within a close proximity to where I live. GDP may be effective for measuring economic output, but it's insufficient when it comes to measuring what actually matters to people. Now need to begin planning for different demographic factors. Cities that are growing, cities that are declining, elderly age groups growing, youth bulges, projects that are built without the consultation process. They're more supply driven as opposed to demand driven. Participatory planning exercises tend to be done after the decision is already made, and they tend not to be linked with resources as well.
My guest today has spent years studying not just how cities grow, but how decisions, economics, and power shape who benefits from that growth. Kyle Farrell is an urban and regional economist who works with governments and global organizations on evidence-based urban policy. Today we are not talking about ideal cities. We are talking about how cities really function and why so many of them fail the people they are supposed to serve. Hi Kyle, welcome to the Human City podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Ruchita. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited for today's discussions.
Kyle, a lot of people today question whether GDP is even the right way to measure success, not just for countries but for cities too. As an example, on paper, though India's total GDP looks impressive, but once you factor in the population, the story flips in terms of productivity, living standards, and urban quality. So, from your work, what does this kind of comparison get wrong about how we judge urban success? And what should we be looking at instead?
In the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a spotlight on the conversation about what does GDP do well versus what does it not do well. And the GDP may be an effective metric for measuring economic output, but it's insufficient when it comes to measuring what actually matters to people. And that's in terms of their quality of life, their satisfaction, their well-being. And you're seeing a lot of different initiatives emerge in recent times around how do we measure that other side beyond GDP. A new initiative that UN Habitat has been involved on quality of life in cities. And so GDP is a insufficient metric in the sense that you can have a city that's growing economically, but at the same time, you can have it be this economic growth being detrimental to other factors of the city.
But then do you mean that indexes like livability index or ease to commute index be a better framework in comparison to GDP?
Well, I think you're never going to find the perfect metric that measures everything. And the idea is to kind of try to understand what is it that makes cities successful, and then to understand how do we measure those factors. And the economy is definitely one of those factors, but there's other factors in cities as well, such as safety, housing affordability, access to public spaces or public transport. UN Habitat's quality of life index has been looking at not just the objective factors, but also the subjective factors. And it's interesting because it's one thing to say that your city is safe because crime rates are low, but it's another thing to ask someone, do you feel safe in that city? And it's unlikely you're going to find that in one number. So it's probably you're going to see more success if you look at a number of different metrics, and usually that comes in form of an index.
But just take safety as a factor. Now, safety is different for every person. Now, in females also, if one area is safe for one female, maybe it might not be safe for another female. So how do you measure that? Because when it comes to subjective answers, it's going to be different for every person.
Subjective metrics also have shortfalls to them as well, because if you're asking somebody a question on one day versus another day or within a different context, that can change as well. But I think it does give a bit better of an indication of what people are thinking and what's important to them, and bringing people together to kind of share experiences. And from those shared experiences, you try to unpack what is the hindrances within the urban environment. So like you mentioned, maybe for one person, it's a sense of insecurity or a lack of safety. For another person, it's the threat of not being seen by people around them. And maybe then the intervention has to do with more street lighting or trying to activate streets so that not everything closes at the same time, and so that there's more eyes on the street. It could be mixed use neighborhoods. So there could be different interventions, but I think the idea is through this consensus building, you start to unpack the issues and understand strengths and weaknesses weaknesses within our urban environment.
Okay. If we start measuring a city's urban success, so what would be those indicators which should always be there, except some maybe we can avoid?
I'm an urban economist and try to understand those hidden factors that are shaping cities. So factors that come to mind are time, for example. So commute time. So if I live in one area and I work in another area, my overall well-being and probably my ability to contribute to productivity in the cities will go down if I have a longer commute time, both in terms of me being able to spend time at my job, but in terms of my energy and my happiness and all that I would bring to my job. Another example could be around accessibility. So you ask yourselves, when you look at the population of a city as well, certain groups in that city have access to certain things, whether that be housing, jobs, services. And their ability to access is a factor in their ability to contribute to the economy, also contributes to their overall well-being in cities.
But we are obsessed with sizes like biggest economy, fastest growth, most projects, so much of development, urbanization, that we ignore whether cities are actually becoming better place to live. So how do you get away with that obsession? Because a city is measured only through those factors.
There's a diagram I remember from an urban economics course I took a long time ago, and it tries to look at the size of a city in terms of population, and then it also looks at the efficiency of the city. You look at a city like Tokyo. Tokyo has continued to grow because it has good governance. They've been able to ensure efficiency in processes. They've been able to remove some of those frictions I mentioned before. Other cities, Lagos, for example, it's continued to grow, but at certain points, I think the friction becomes more of a pushback on the population, and people then start to look for alternative places to live as well. So I would say, if you ask yourself how big can a city grow, that deeply depends on the effectiveness of the governance and their ability to minimize those frictions that people face on a day-to-day.
So, whenever we talk about urban growth, we always treat migrants as the major problem. But UN Habitat shows that most urban growth in the global south comes from natural population increase, not migration. So, what is the biggest misunderstanding policymakers have about why cities in developing countries are really growing?
Yeah, in fact, cities grow for three reasons. The first reason is through rural to urban migration, as you mentioned. The next reason is through natural population growth, so more births than deaths. And the third reason is for administrative factors, so administrative reclassification. And so depending on what type of growth is occurring, it's going to require very different policy responses. And the other factor I would say is that cities are really a drawing force because they offer opportunities. They have deeper labor markets. They do a better job at matching skills. If you have certain skills and I need those skills, then I can match the right employee with the right employer, and so on and so forth. So you can see that urbanization is like a very varied context, and people end up in cities for varied reasons. And I think that's an important thing to take into consideration.
But again, don't you think that misunderstanding translate into bad housing and infrastructure decisions also?
Well, I would say the biggest reason that we find unplanned growth in cities is really a failure to plan in advance. And so I think you're never going to engineer urbanization, but you can tell when people are moving to your cities, housing shortfalls, over congestion on roads, and so on and so forth. So the role of cities and their planning departments to be able to anticipate that growth and then be able to grow accordingly. And I think when you see the rise of informality in cities, this is a government failure and a market failure because you're not able to produce the right services and the right assets for those people coming in and being able to respond to the demands of different income groups in the process. So a lot of it comes down not necessarily to this natural process of urbanization that we're seeing happening in all over the world. A lot of it comes down to our inability to plan in advance and be able to incorporate that growth.
You spoke about data. The World Bank often says that problem isn't lack of data. It's lack of systems and incentives to use it. So instead of asking why evidence loses to politics, which it does in most of the cities and most of the countries, what would a city need to put in a place tomorrow to make evidence actually shape decisions, not just reports?
I would say one of the biggest challenges, I think, when we come to evidence based decision making is the timescales. When it comes to the evidence or the data side, usually we try to look at it over longer time horizons and over 10 to 20 years. Major infrastructure projects fall into that category. When it comes to the politics, I think there's a tendency to think more around political cycles, which tend to be 4 to 5 years. And so there's a mismatch there. And so how do we resolve that? I think there are good examples out there where people have taken longer term transformational shifts and broken them down along to political cycles and being able to respond accordingly. I think also the research community, academia has played a really important role at bridging that gap as well, ensuring that initiatives that might have started under one political cycle will continue forward and tracking that from a data standpoint as well. But I'd say that's one of the biggest challenges that many cities face today is how do we get long-term decisions made along shorter-term political cycles?
You mentioned that academia does that kind of research, but that balance between academia and the people who are implementing, that's really not there.
Well, when I think about the planning process, I tend to see that it follows different sequences. So you might have political figures that come in and promise a certain amount of housing that might then be made as a priority in the visioning of an urban plan. But the evidence base needs to be there in order to show how that can actually unfold over a plan, and whether that be short-term planning or long-term planning. All of this needs to be factored in. Based on our previous trends of building housing, we're nowhere near being able to meet that demand. So then what are the intermediary options for that? Do we need to temper our expectations? Do we need to come up with new solutions? Part of the conversation needs to be about what are our solutions, what are our options, and how can we think outside of the box to be able to meet those demands.
So, what could be one simple system, a rule, a process, or maybe a checklist that could make evidence harder to ignore?
I find the most compelling evidence that work with statistics tends to be around storytelling. And it tends to be about making this evidence real and putting a face to this evidence as well. So I think the better that we get at being able to distill this data that many people tend to find boring into compelling stories that actually speak to lived experiences, I think that's kind of best.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So now let's talk about the public participation. Everyone agrees that participation is often tokenistic. So yeah, you have worked on participation and community-led planning through block by block in very different contexts. So in your experience, what does participation look like when it actually change outcomes, and how do cities build that kind of process?
So I'm going to start just by sharing the block by block story because I think it's a really interesting one. Around about 2012, we were working on a public space exercise in Kibera, which is the biggest informal settlement in Nairobi. And we observed that when we invited the community out to weigh in on the design of the public space, it tended to be a middle-aged to elderly male, and they tended to be the leaders of the community. And we felt, given that we were focusing on public space and public space is for everybody, we felt like we only had a small piece of the community that we wanted to get at. So we got in touch with Minecraft, or Mojang, the creators of Minecraft, and we decided to pilot this idea where we used Minecraft as a urban design tool. And what we found from that process was actually the children don't tend to come out by themselves. They tend to come out with their carers, which can be mothers and grandmothers, sometimes fathers. And so we had a much more mixed demographic that represented the community that we were working with. We built a model of their community. We had them break up into different groups and be able to design what they wanted to see in their community. We saw soccer pitches, playgrounds, features like benches and streetlights and so on and so forth. And we started to develop this into a methodology where we would then show all the different models that all the different groups created. We would consolidate them into one model. We would go through a checklist of what were the most important priorities. And from there, we would then produce the final model that would then be turned into an actual architectural design. And then we would finance the building of this. Another benefit of this exercise was that Minecraft is rather a blocky, pixelated game. And so it took the attention off of details. So people wouldn't worry so much about the color of a doorknob, and instead they would just worry more about the idea. And I'd say that the final lesson we learned from that is that gaming can be a really important communication tool as well. The block by block story for me is a really good example of how you could take participatory planning. You can build on what we viewed as conventional participatory planning to make sure you're reaching other groups, and you can have a lot of fun in the process. And today, Block by Blocks worked in about 135 cities around the world. We built about 300 projects. We've raised about $25 million, all contributed towards using gaming to build public space in communities around the world.
This is a great example in cities where there are a lot of projects to be implemented and you already have less resources. So what are the three non-negotiables which one should consider as part of public participation, which government should actually take that into account?
Yeah, and one of the biggest challenges, something we also experienced in our work, is scaling. Right? You see a lot of projects that are built without the consultation process, and they're more supply driven as opposed to demand driven, and they don't fully get utilized. One of the biggest shortfalls we tend to see in participatory planning exercises is that they tend to be done after the decision is already made, and they tend not to be linked with resources as well. And so these are two critical factors that we need to resolve. Is if you're going to do a participatory process, and you can't have participatory processes unless they are tied to mechanisms that are going to ensure their effective implementation, such as budget allocations and prioritization of decisions.
Also, many times we implement great pilot projects, but again, nothing really changes at the scale. Because if you want to expand it at a city level or maybe at a neighborhood level, it really doesn't. So, from your experience, what's the one thing cities must build so participation doesn't stay stuck at the project level?
So, in the experience of block by block, that was one of the big challenges we were trying to surmount in our work. Is it's one thing to do a one-off project, and in our case, projects that got a lot of media attention, but it's another thing to convince the local planning departments and the city to then be able to replicate that. And I think part of that was actually making sure that they owned the process themselves. So all of our projects were partnered with the local community, but also with the city themselves to show them that they're the ones who are bringing this change to their communities. I find participation becomes most effective when it has the budget behind it to be able to be implemented as well. So for us to be serious as well about participation, we need to ensure that the budgets are allocated for that.
Now, focusing on the youth participation, youth are most of the time out of these public participation meetings. But again, what changes when young people move from being consulted to being trusted with real decisions, especially as part of these government public participation projects?
So one of the things that shocked and impressed me the most with the block by block work that we were using Minecraft as a participatory urban planning tool, you had a lot of young people who viewed themselves as gamers and savvy using computer games or digital tools to be able to contribute. But when you allowed them to actually affect change in their communities, they looked at themselves no longer just as gamers, but also as city changers. And some of these actually went on to become urban planners and architects. So I think a byproduct of this process was really building that confidence and showing that these silly skills that your parents will often refer to, it actually can lead to professional skills that can actually jumpstart a career.
Also, from your experience, what's the one mistake cities repeat every time when they try to engage with communities?
I think the biggest thing I see is that cities tend to go in with preconceived notions and thinking they already have the solution. And I think when you go into a participatory planning process, you need to go in with a clean slate and realize that those people in the community probably know a lot more about their community than even the professional planners, economists, and architects.
Any participatory process, if you have seen it for urban level projects where the public participation was done very creatively?
There was this idea from, I believe it was Jamie Lerner, former mayor of Ruchita, Brazil, who talked about urban acupuncture. And the idea was not to do one-off isolated projects, but do small projects, small interventions all over the city, kind of like acupuncture. I think the idea being if you treat a city like that and you do an intervention in different places throughout the city, it has the ability to reshape the city as a whole. Again, those tend to be small scale micro interventions, but added up, they have a bigger macro effect across the city. And I think it's that sort of thinking that can really help us not just have isolated projects, but be able to actually reshape the whole city.
So, if you could redesign urban policy from scratch, what would you stop doing immediately and what would you start doing that isn't happening today?
Well, I think the biggest thing is this idea of adaptive planning. We're not going to master plan our way into certainty. So I think we need to be adaptive and we need to be incremental in our ways. We talk a lot more these days about risk and uncertainty in cities. And I think that means we need to change how we think about the planning process. And so building resilience through adaptation, through incremental planning, through even community-led planning as well. I think a lot of the communities have a better sense of what the threats are to where they live and also a lot of knowledge of local solutions as well.
So, what's one reform that sounds unrealistic but is actually necessary as part of the urban policy?
So one thing that comes to my mind is that we now need to begin planning as well for different demographic factors. So demographics is really shaping our cities today. We have some cities that are growing, other cities that are declining. We have certain age groups as well, elderly age groups growing, and in some areas youth bulges. And so how do we build our cities not just for our average user, but how do we build cities now for that can respond to the needs of these different demographic groups? And we as planners need to start being able to respond to that.
That's true. I guess we need to change our planning principles. I never thought about that, but yes, whenever we are making master plan, we always have some criteria and we just go by that and then we start making assumptions as per that.
Yeah.
Okay, who needs to change first? Planners, politicians, or institutions?
Good question. I'm going to say another group, and I'm going to say the private sector, because I tend to believe that markets have a big influence on cities. So I think that there's a real opportunity now for the private sector to come in and play a role in how we shape our cities, but not just in terms of how we shape our cities from a return on investment perspective, but actually how we get back to how this conversation started between you and I, Ruchita. How do we build cities that actually respond more to livability, quality of life, and well-being? Because that will dictate which cities are going to be successful and which cities will fail in the future.
And you have more than 2 decades of experience. So, what's one belief about cities you have changed your mind on over the years?
The one thing that impresses me the most about cities is its self-organization. You're bringing together a lot of people in relatively small areas, and there's a lot of variables at play. People need to get from home to work. You need to drop the kids off. Companies need to meet up. And all of this is happening in the same space. And there's something about cities that allow all of this self-organization to take place that I don't think we fully understand. And that's what impresses me most about cities. I think there's a certain charm to the fact that there's a lot happening behind the scenes that we're not aware of and we can't explain. And that's a little bit the magic of cities.
This reminds me what Eva Kale mentioned in the last podcast that cities are not like plants, they are man-made. So you can make them the way you want them.
No matter how we plan them and what the intentions are, there's certain incentives behind the scene that are leading to this self-organization and allowing cities to function. Even the cities that we would consider not success stories are able to still operate and still function in incredible ways that is just difficult to explain when you bring that many people together.
Tell me, what's one city that surprised you, not because it was flashy, but because it quietly worked?
I think the city I always enjoy going to in terms of intrigue, wonder, efficiency, surprise, interest is Seoul, South Korea. It's a city that I think, even as somebody who doesn't speak the language, I can navigate. It's designed in a predictable yet unpredictable way. I would say at a larger scale, it's quite predictable the way the metro system works, the way that housing is arranged, but it's unpredictable in the way that you have these pocket neighborhoods, these mixed use areas, street art, parks that pop up out of nowhere that just create this sense of excitement as you navigate the city.
So, if you had real power for 1 year in any city, what's the first thing you would change?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would change in most cities would be zoning. I'm a big fan of mixed use. I'm a big fan of being able to run all my errands, take care of everything, all within a close proximity to where I live, but even using other parts of the cities and being able to have that similar experience. So for me, the zoning is a big factor. And I would say, again, getting back to our examples before of East Asia, Japan and Korea have really interesting zoning laws. The Japanese zoning system, it's a tiered zoning system that allows you to include anything underneath it in terms of the tiers. So I think industrial activity is separate, but if you have commercial area, you can also have residential in it, and you can also have different services in it. And so as long as it's zoned for one of the higher order categories, you're allowed to include everything underneath it. And that creates for very interesting communities.
So, what's your thought on the 15-minute city concept?
Well, so my view on the 15-minute city is that it's great in terms of that it's trying to promote that mixed use, everything you need within a close proximity to you. In reality, and coming from an economic perspective as well, I think you tend to have a hierarchy when it comes to services and when it comes to infrastructure and when it comes to amenities. So I think the concept or the idea behind the 15-minute city is more just, do people have access to the services and amenities that they need to operate within close proximity of themselves? And I'd say that's something that we should be striving for as a city. So I think to speak about the 15-minute city on its own is one thing, but I think when you factor in the different demographic groups and the preferences of different age groups, that's another important conversation to be had.
Yeah, I guess maybe the concept changes from cities to cities and the requirement they have. So thank you, Kyle. This conversation makes one thing very clear, that cities don't fail because of lack of ideas. They fail because of gap between evidence and power, between intention and execution. So thank you for cutting through the comfort talk and getting into what really shapes our cities. For everyone listening, if there's one takeaway from today, it's this: better cities don't come from better slogans, they come from better decisions and the courage to make them. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you so much. We covered a lot of territory, but it was a lot of fun. Thank you,
Yeah.
Ruchita.